Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for filtering your way in after lunch. And this is the panel discussion on road transport and the environment. I'm Chris Walton. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Motor Transport, Commercial Motor and Truck and Driver, all of which I think have been thoroughly well represented on this stage this morning. And I'd like to thank my panel for coming through this afternoon. If you don't mind just going through and introducing yourself as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Flack. I was sitting on this very platform 1 year ago as the Alternative Fuels Director for Iveco in the UK. Since then, I've been fortunate enough to be able to retire from the day job, and I'm now doing a little bit of consultancy, but also when it's a nice day, I'm out in the garden, and it's really very pleasant. I can recommend it.
So jealous.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Burnett. I'm the Chief Exec of the Road Haulage Association. Again, I was standing up here last year talking about clean air and the environment, and I think this is a theme that we're going to be picking up this afternoon in today's panel discussion.
Good afternoon, Graham Lackey. I've been Managing Director at Brit European now for 11 years, 20 odd years in logistics and about 30 odd years in transport. So I look pretty good for 25. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dominic Finn. Work for Client Earth. We're an environmental law organisation, and I work within the Clean Air team. We've been holding the UK government to account over the last 9 years for failing to deliver a lawful plan to tackle illegal levels of air quality. That's kind of escalated over the last 5 years as we had 3 legal cases. So we've been behind that pressure on government to deliver plans, and now I'm working with businesses as part of the campaign to try and understand what businesses need to see to shift to cleaner vehicles and make sure that government puts in place policy to help a nice, smooth transition, which lots more work to be done on that, obviously.
Okay, I'd like to start with the first question of, it's quite a simple one really. Is the road transport industry an easy target for environmental legislation?
Would you like me to pick that up?
If you don't, I don't mind doing pick it up. Go ahead.
Well, in 2010 there was a limit set for air pollution. EU Ambient Air Directive was updated and set legal limits, and we're looking at concentrations, not overall emissions. So the actual concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, the main emitter is diesel, diesel vehicles, and road transport, obviously. Largely fueled by diesel, particularly since 2000 when uptake was promoted. So it's not road transport that is the focus. A lot of it is the kind of the emissions from diesel. So we certainly are seeing developments, and there's lots of alternatives out there. We've still got an issue, and there's a long way to go. But it's there's not really been enough structure, enough regulatory certainty, enough support from government to help businesses and individuals switch from polluting vehicles. So that's where my role fits in, is trying to help government put in place sensible policy.
Richard,
I would have a counter view to that. I think that as an industry, we're seen as an easy target. We're seen as the kicking boys, and I think that from my perspective, if you look at the WHO statistics and evidence that kind of sits behind the reasons why we're looking at clean air zones to the extent that we are, and the challenge that you've taken to government, the evidence and impact of air quality, there are many doctors out there that are still saying there is insufficient evidence to demonstrate that the challenges that are being brought to us as an industry are actually kind of playing out. I think if you look at other sectors, if you look at manufacturing, if you look at how we produce electricity, they are actually creating more pollutants than actually vehicles on the road. And when you take vehicles on the road in the round, the vast proportion, as we heard before in the conference, most of the emittents are being created by cars, not trucks. And as an industry, we're trying to do more, to clean up, more Euro 6s on the road. We're looking at alternative technologies, but we're a really marginal industry. And if you look at the number of operators that we've got out there, you know, the 75,000 operators licenses, if you take the duplicates out, you get down to about 68,000 companies that operate within the UK. 55,000 of those are 5 trucks and less, and 29,000 have just got 1 truck. So, you know, those are small, medium-sized enterprises. They're small, you know, medium-sized businesses. And the big operators may well be able to invest in new technology, new trucks, but actually the vast proportion of the market made up by those SMEs are going to really struggle to kind of take some of these new technologies on within the timeframes that are being driven. And I think the way in which this is being rolled out is a massive challenge for our industry and unfair.
Yeah. Can I just jump in with a sort of general comment to try and set the scene a little bit? That there's always great confusion when you get anything in terms of the environment between looking at the emissions which affect local air quality. So there we're talking NOx, we're talking particulates, and emissions which affect global warming. So there we're talking CO2. And of course, a vehicle which drives up and down the motorway and never goes into a city centre is actually needs to focus on what will be the best technology to improve the CO2 output and therefore global warming, and needs to be less worried about air quality in the city. A vehicle which is running only in the city needs to be looking at air quality and less about CO2 emissions. So, you know, the crazy thing, London has reductions on the congestion charging zone if you have a low CO2 vehicle. London does not have a CO2 problem, it has an air quality problem. But that's more difficult to actually achieve a charging regime based on emissions of NOx and particulates.
Graham, you're one of these medium-sized companies that we've been talking about. Do you feel like you'll be made an easy target for some of the legislations that are coming through?
I think yes, but I think we all have a view, certainly within my business, that we need to take the lead anyway. Where you come into problems is there's a real lack of clarity on direction from the people at the top, and there's no joining up with the people that are going to enable that, whether it's the fuel suppliers, whether it's the OEMs. We've seen it on a number of initiatives and truck trials and what have you recently that we've been part of. So there needs to be a bit more of a joined up approach. And one of the things announced today, I think, gives us perhaps that forum to have that voice, which is nice to hear. As operators, Richard's already mentioned, it's very tight margins. I'm not sure that, have we got any charitable truck operators in the audience? I don't think so. So we all need to make money and turn cash to still be here. If I go to my customers, they're not going to pay a premium for these changes. And then as a business, the more specialist you are, the longer the time frames to change your truck fleet is. So, you know, if you're on a 3-year cycle on your trucks, fantastic. If you're more specialist, that cycle could be 10 years. And that's a real challenge, especially when you look at some of the hurdles that are being put in place. So I think there needs to be a dose of realism applied. But I think most of us are up for it as long as there's clarity and there is that commercial reality that's going with it.
I think when I'm talking about some of the legislation, I'm primarily referring to more localised urban legislation. So you have the ultra clean air zone in London and whatever the other one is around Greater London. There's so many of them, I get confused. You look at what's going to happen within Leeds, within Birmingham, proposals for Manchester. It's a very fragmented and urbanised approach. If we sat back rationally, is that the best way to address environmental and air quality concerns within the UK as a whole, or is it right to then target the areas where there is the greatest risk? I don't know, Dominic, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, the legal challenges were to government, to DEFRA. DEFRA, the outcome of the second court case, was 2015, was that the government has to address the legal levels of air quality as soon as possible. And that challenges with DEFRA. And what's happened is the book has been passed to local authorities. Michael Gove responding to this clean air campaign in the Times, or DEFRA responding to that in the Times yesterday, again talking about how local authorities are required to deliver plans to address this. And on the one hand, you do need to take into consideration local conditions. You absolutely have to do that, but there's definitely a need for a national framework with a common structure, common payment methods, some common signage, things as simple as that, a whole range of things which certainly can be put in place at a central level, and also funding as well. So Leeds quite successfully lobbied government for 23 million, I think it was, to help businesses adapt to the clean air zone there. And that's great, but you know, when you've got Derby who's missing deadlines and not really releasing a plan at all, and Nottingham doesn't have a clean air zone, which seems to have a pretty decent plan, but you've got this mishmash of things across the country, and it's understandably driving businesses very frustrating for businesses. So keep the pressure on government to deliver that national framework. It's got to be in there. It's got to be national action, and not only is it the right thing to do, but it's legally required of them. And so you know they're not stepping up yet, and so that's where our pressure will continue. You know, and to the point about road transport, yeah, you're bearing the brunt of it. Obviously tight margins, and you're having to adapt to this. Who isn't bearing the brunt is the auto sector, who actually, there's talk in the news this morning. I saw Renault potentially having legal action against them for their role in diesel emission cheating for cars, obviously not heavy goods vehicles. So a lot of the auto manufacturers are at it. They've not been held accountable in this country or across Europe. They should be held accountable and pay for misleading people, and that money should go towards helping businesses and consumers to shift to cleaner vehicles.
So with the introduction of more punitive measures of entering clean air zones, is that punishment for not being at the acceptable level high enough to instigate the type of change that you would like to see, Dominic?
Would a clean air, sorry, a bit of reverb there.
Yeah, same for me. I was just saying, with the introduction of fines for not being compliant with clean air zones, is that the kind of punishment that would instigate the type of change that you would like to see within users of commercial vehicles?
Well, I think DEFRA's own modelling shows that clean air zones, charging clean air zones, are the most effective way to deliver air quality in a shorter time possible. I mentioned Nottingham. Their modelling has shown that they're going to meet legal limits without a clean air zone. That's because they've been investing in low and zero emission public transport for a number of years. With time frame short, charging clean air zones appear to be the best way to address that. But you can't just use a stick. There's got to be a carrot there as well, and you've got to try and close that. There's going to be disruption. Any time there's I think there's a disruption like this, there's a disruption to the market. There's going to have a knock-on effect. But it's government's responsibility to minimise that and make the transition as smooth as possible.
Yeah.
I think. I was just going to say, we don't want a penal approach. We don't think that's going to work. And 98% of everything we consume is delivered on a truck. If you can't go into city centres because you're going to get charged to do it, that's a massive on-cost to hauliers. You do that every single day. £100 today, in London, £50 in Leeds. When you look at how much a haulier might make, and you look at an average of maybe £60 per week per truck, and you look at that charge on top, and if you can't pass that on, then effectively you've got a big commercial issue, and that's going to put businesses out of business if those charges can't be passed on. But we also have a significant level of fleet within the UK market that still needs to be at Euro 6. There are 498,000 trucks in the UK, and at the moment there's probably something like 170,000, maybe slightly less, that are Euro 6. And, we've got the life of a truck, which is, in some cases 10 years, depends what mileage you're doing. But for many hauliers, they haven't got the ability to change their truck.
Yeah.
And if you're going to get penalised for going into a city centre, then that's going to stop allowing us to deliver the goods that everybody needs. Government, and our conversations with government, with Michael Gove, I've had direct conversations with Gove and with Rutley and with Jesse Norman about these issues, and they're turning their back on it. And I agree with what you're saying, which is, this approach to the devolved power and how that power is being, I guess given to local authorities, creating a patchwork, a massive complexity for us. There's no joined up thinking, there's no clarity, and there is no way that actually, we as an industry can cope with, I guess, the level of change that's likely to be rolled out, but also that penal cost is a significant cost. There is no retrofit. So when you go back to Leeds and you go back to the clean air, zone in Leeds and how much money they've got to help support businesses get over it, well, they want to give money for retrofits. There is no retrofit available for any HGV truck. How's that going to work? These are significant issues. And if you then kind of, let's mention the B word just very quickly, we're still not out of the woods there. We don't know what's going to happen. We've got government, again, unjoined up thinking about tariffs. So in the event of no deal, if we do crash out without a deal, they're going to apply a 22% tariff on any brand new truck that you're going to buy. So that puts another 20 grand on the price of a truck, pushing it even further out. So we've got lots of uncertainty, we've got lots of issues, but we need to kind of try and get government to understand that this devolved approach is not helping this industry. And that's part of what Mike Penning and the APPG are going to help us with in terms of really trying to get cross-government focus on a more joined up approach to supporting this industry with clean air.
Just to add a comment, that I think at the moment, I don't think there's really any argument about the need to improve air quality in the cities. The problem that we have is that because successive governments over the years have been very inactive at looking at seriously what to do about urban air quality. In fact, if you go back 10 years ago, they were encouraging us all to drive diesel cars and to drive them into the city centre because diesel cars were low emission, CO2. And what we then end up with is that a government decision a few years ago has actually worsened the problem with air quality in the cities. And now they're trying to run to catch up. And I quite support Richard's view is that the vehicle park, there's less than half of the vehicle park will be Euro 6. And if you then go into vans, it'll be even worse because the van Euro 6 vehicles only came in from 2016. At least with the trucks, it was from 2014. So there's hardly any of the van fleet are going to actually be Euro 6. So it becomes a big challenge for the operator, largely because government didn't do what they should have been doing 10, 15, 20 years ago.
I think we've also got a big issue with the second-hand market, So exactly. So who wants a Euro 5 or below? Where are these trucks? Where are these vehicles going to go? These are the basic financial implications of what we're trying to do here. But government needs to understand that impact, and they need to support far more than they are.
And talking of the second-hand market, historically, quite a percentage of vehicles would be exported to sub-Saharan Africa, particularly right-hand drive territories, and that trade is drying up now because those guys can buy Chinese-built products, brand new, for pretty much the price we would have been selling them 5-year-old Euro 5 vehicles. The whole business of the used vehicle market is put in crisis because the domestic market is just dead.
Graham, how has the introduction of clean air zones and the potential introduction of them changed the way that you purchase vehicles? Does it kind of keep you awake at night, or is it just a route that you would have been planning on with regardless?
Well, the whole thing is sort of testing me. I've probably got 20 years left before I have to step aside. And over those 20 years, we're going to see probably the biggest change in the industry over its entire life. As an operator today, you have confidence in buying a vehicle new at a certain price, I don't know, 80,000 for a tractor unit. You run that unit, its life, you're going to run it 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, whatever your cycle is as a business, and you know what at the end of it, it's going to be worth. Yeah. That goes back into your calculations for your contract price. Pretty straightforward. Looking forward, we're going to have a mix of vehicles. So depending on what we're doing them, we're probably going to end up with different technologies, certainly as an interim step, because what's right for urban distribution is not going to be right for long haul distribution. So we're going to have two different types of technologies. On top of that, at the moment, we buy a truck and then we pay for its maintenance and everything else throughout its life. Think about all the battery technology and all the plug-ins and everything else we've talked about today. Instead of 80,000, you're going to be paying 120 because actually it won't have the in-life costs. If I sat here and said to some of the audience, you've now got to increase your finance lines to your business by 50% tomorrow, are your financiers going to actually advance that amount of money to you? So there's some pretty fundamental differences to the business model going forward than we sit today. And I'm not sure those considerations have been taken into account. The OEMs have got to consider it, otherwise they won't sell any trucks. RHA will be representing us with government because they've got to understand that's what you're going to do to the industry. And ultimately, if there aren't the trucks and aren't us to do it, nothing's going to move, is it? But it is as fundamental as that.
It's a good point, which actually picks up on something in an article I've done for Motor Transport, that as an OEM, we would always look at what's the total cost of ownership. So we'd be very focused on TCO. The vehicle costs you this more, the cost of the fuel, the cost of the maintenance means that over a 3, 4, 5 year period, this vehicle will give a positive TCO. And the point I really picked up only a short while ago writing this article was that in many companies, the capex is actually just as important as the total cost of ownership, total cost of operation. And it's exactly as you're saying, Graham, where you need to have that finance available up front, or ability to be funded for it, which in small companies, if you increase your funding by 50%, that's a challenge. And it may be that the thing pays back over a period, but you've gone bankrupt before that happens.
Me and Richard were having this discussion before we got on the stage, but does the challenges that we face within the UK in terms of improving air quality, all that kind of thing, should that then go on and lead to a change in discussion in how that commercial vehicles are bought and sold? So normally a operator would go in and say, I've always run this type of vehicle, it's always been good in my operation, what price can you do me for? Fantastic. Should we now be going in and having discussions and saying, this is my type of operation, what solution do you have that can fit what I do? So if they are saying you are very much urban, the solution should be electric, we should be looking at what your route planning is, and we should be looking at the environmental impact of what that purchasing decision is. Am I taking too much of a leap here in assuming that those discussions are going to happen?
I think one of the things that's very clear is that we've been very happy with a one-size-fits-all. So if you look at the truck market in the UK, or commercial vehicle market, you've got vans at 3.5 tonnes, you've got a diminishing population of vehicles around about 7.5 tonnes, you've got a population around 18 tonnes and 26 tonnes on rigids, and then you've got 6x2 Arctics and a handful of 4x2 Arctics. And people will buy a 6x2 Arctic and they maybe run at 44 tonnes once a year. But everybody buys a 6x2 Arctic. Everybody buys a sleeper cab because the residual value of a sleeper cab is better than the residual value of a day cab. When you want to get to the point that you are using the right vehicle for the right job, you can't do that. You've got to have a vehicle which is an urban vehicle, and you've got to have a vehicle which is a long distance vehicle, because the technologies which will work for one or the other at this moment in time and for the foreseeable future won't be the same technology. Now, maybe in the future that will change and we'll have a technology that will enable us to do both operations and go back to the one-size-fits-all. I doubt it. I think that you're going to have to tailor vehicles for the operation, for the emissions requirement. And it's fairly clear that whether it's 2025, 2040, 2050, urban areas will go zero emission. And then we have a big challenge as to how do we go zero emission, because zero emission means either electric or hydrogen. Yeah. So are you going to have an electric vehicle running up and down the M1? Well, I doubt it. Are you going to have a hydrogen vehicle running up and down the M1? I doubt it. You can't carry enough fuel on the vehicle. So then you get to zero emission capable. And that's where I think there's probably a role of a vehicle which will run up and down the motorway with a low emission engine, using a biofuel of some sort or other, and it will get to the M25, the North Circular, or wherever that boundary is, and will then turn automatically onto electric or hydrogen and will run into the urban environment zero emission. That's where we need to be heading for. But urban vehicles will go zero emission. Long distance vehicles probably less so.
I think what part of the conversation that we were having was I guess more a debate about the truck manufacturers, and one of the things that came out of the MAN presentation this morning was, I guess, their focus on the operator more and the use. So going back to one size fits all, part of my experience before I did this job, the last trucks that I bought before I ended up doing this job, we were very traditional in terms of how we'd go out and buy trucks, same size engine, etc. But there wasn't sufficient focus on what's the topography, where are we, where are we pulling out of, what's the sort of work that we're doing. And actually the benefit was more when we got into the nuts and bolts of gearing with a combination of engine size that actually gave us the best return in terms of fuel, for instance. So I guess what you're also saying, is there needs to be more of a change in terms of how the truck manufacturers are working even closer with operators to truly understand the range of operations and where they're going to be using vehicles in the future, taking into account the things that you've just talked about, Martin. But I guess there needs to be a step change in that. That was the sense, wasn't it?
Yeah. Graham, you run 34 gas-powered trucks. Am I right in thinking that? What has your experience been of those, and how do you see that technology being rolled out across your fleet?
We're glad we went down that route as a stepping stone, but I think I stood on this stage a number of years ago and said that's all it was. We would like to go all gas, but at the moment I come back to my point about nothing being joined up, because I need the fueling stations to be able to do it. And then you have to pause because government's done it again, because they're talking about not putting gas grid into homes. So is that sending the same message as diesel on where we're going? So that makes you stop. And then you say, well, what about biogas? Well, where's the source coming from? I'm not aware that we could produce enough biogas to actually service our needs if we wanted to. And then you've got a mixture within the OEM. Some have gone gas, some have gone electric. So again, completely confusing. So at the moment, the safe option is to go Euro 6, if I'm blunt and honest.
Yes.
But in terms of ways forward, there's one really glaringly obvious one to me in terms of making a step forward on heavy haulage trucks. Increase the weight and increase the lengths. We've been running now for how long on the extended trailer trial without decisions being made?
9 years that's been running now. 2010 it came in.
So let's make some decisions. 50 tonnes, 20, 21 metres. I'm talking about road trains. I'm talking about a sensible increase. Suddenly you take 10% of the trucks off the road. You need 10% less drivers. We've spent how long talking about drivers today? And straight away we've made a big impact on the environment. So I can't get why we can't make decisions earlier on what I would call pretty sensible, straightforward stuff. Take the low-hanging fruit, is that the term?
Yeah.
And then think about some of the more challenging topics. But again, urban vehicles should be the easiest ones to do. So again, focus on there, you can cover both. I think there's too much talking, not enough decisions being made. But I would say that, wouldn't I?
One of the speakers earlier today was from Amazon, and they've kind of revolutionised home delivery. You can, as my wife will testify, order something that night. It arrives the very next day, and that is now the customer experience. That is what they want. As customers kind of change into that mindset, and they're probably there already, it will have huge impacts on urban areas again, on clean air within those areas. So at one point we are benefiting people greatly in the way that they live their lives. Are we then taking into account the environmental impact of that as a logistics industry? Dominic, I don't know if...
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think it was referenced, talk about lots of ambition and not much action. I was reading the Future Mobility Strategy, which, there's lots of good scene setting, but, not much concrete in there. But they did mention this point about home delivery. And I think, there's a counter-argument that people, when they get it delivered to their home, they're not driving the car to the supermarket or to the high street. So, there's obviously counter argument to it. I don't think there's been enough evidence, or there's not enough evidence there yet to say which one has a small environmental impact. Yeah. So it's just one of those trends in there. But yeah, so I think the jury's still out for me on that, and my organisation.
Yeah, the argument would be that if my wife drives 10 miles to go to the supermarket and uses X amount of fuel and therefore puts out X amount of CO2 and NOx and particulates, would it be better that one van had 10, 15, 20 loads on it to deliver in that area? And the answer is generally speaking yes, but not always. The bit that concerned me this morning that I'd just pick up on was if we go to O licensing for vehicles above 2.5 tonnes, the risk of that, and partly what's happened with the driving licence from 7.5 tonnes going down to 3.5, is that the current 3.5 tonne market, which is very large, will all move down to 2.5 tonnes, and everyone will be surprised that you need two 2.5 tonne vehicles to do the job of a 3.5 tonne vehicle. And we'll have more vehicles on the road rather than less. So we need to be very sure that there's a very holistic approach taken, and something which is perfectly valid concept from a safety and an operator compliance point of view to actually take in the 3.5 tonne vehicle doesn't have an unintended consequence of actually making emissions worse.
Yeah. We've seen lots of clean air legislation and environmental legislation that is punitive. Within the carrot and stick approach, what is the stick? What is the thing that could encourage more commercial vehicle operators to be much more environmentally aware of their impact without issuing fines or that kind of thing? What would be the thing that could fix it?
Make it commercially cheaper.
Yeah. Bottom line, it's got to be.
I think that there needs to be a slightly more balanced approach in terms of time. We've got Dominic on the end that's, I guess, fighting government from a client perspective, saying we need cleaner air quicker. We all want cleaner air. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think in terms of global warming, the environmental impact, I think we're all becoming far more aware of what that means. But I think there's a practicality to change, and there needs to be a slightly more balanced approach in terms of an acceptance of how much time it takes to change. We're trying to fix something immediately, which we can't fix commercially within the worlds that we operate unless that cost can be passed on immediately. And that's going to affect all of us in terms of, I guess, the true cost of distribution and, the cost of consumer goods, for all of us. But what we're trying to do with government at the moment is try and persuade and work with them to understand that actually what you're doing with this devolved approach is going to have a detrimental effect. And I think in London we have been lobbying hard with the mayor to say, look, this is the implications of your actions. We've seen that just start to roll out. We're seeing lots of operators that are now saying we simply will not go to London because we can't afford to do it and we can't pass that cost on. Yeah. So that means that you won't get your goods. It's as simple as that.
I think it's important that when targets are set, they're actually realistic and achievable. And I was very aware of this 2 or 3 weeks ago when the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations were going on in London, and they were very earnestly pushing for a zero carbon country by 2025. And even in my wildest optimistic dreams, commercial vehicles which are zero carbon completely by 2025 is just not possible. Mm-hmm. The level of technology readiness from any of the OEMs for alternatives is nowhere near at the stage it would have to be to replace every vehicle that goes into the city centre, yet alone every vehicle which runs, the 500,000 just short of the vehicles which run throughout the UK. You couldn't produce them quick enough. There just isn't the capability to do that, even if the technology readiness was actually further on than it is. No. The MAN vehicle is great. They've got, 10 vehicles which are running an extended field trial, in Austria, Germany. And that's brilliant, and they'll get a lot of good information from that and will learn. But then to go from producing those 10 vehicles to actually producing 50,000 a year is an enormous step that you don't do in a couple of years. You need several years to get there. And even then there's a ramp up, which will take time.
Is one elephant in the room in terms of road transport and the environment fuel duty? Because for the past 10 years, 9 or 10 years, the industry has made a very persuasive economic case to keep fuel duties frozen. But in many ways, a duty on a fossil fuel that is producing pollutants, if it were to increase, is in some way a punitive form of taxation on polluting the environment. So there could be, if there's a change of government, or God knows with politicians, they'd change their mind like the wind these days, but they could very easily adopt a position where duty increases could be seen as the answer to road transport's impact on the environment. And if that were to happen, is there a case where that could happen? And if that were to happen, what would be the impact on the road transport industry?
It's a very blunt instrument, I think, is the point to make, that fuel duty would affect every area where that fuel is being used. It hasn't got any ability to focus. If my challenge is air quality, then raising fuel duty will only have a minor impact there. It will have a bigger impact on vehicles doing long distance who use more fuel. So if anything, it's the wrong approach. You need to be more targeted. And if you're going to do something which is focused, then you have a different road pricing per kilometre in the city and on the motorway, for example. There are other ways you could look at doing that, which would probably be more effective in terms of focusing the attention in the urban environment or on the long distance routes.
I think from my perspective, it's the wrong way to go. We have worked hard with Fair Fuel UK over the last 9 years to keep fuel duty frozen. For some operators that has a beneficial impact. For those that haven't got fuel surcharge mechanisms, for those that do, then any fluctuation that cost just gets passed on. But I think more broadly, the amount of duty that we pay as a country is something like 27 billion. 8 billion comes from this industry. Of that 27 billion, we're making a significant contribution into kind of government's coffers already, and we're not necessarily seeing the benefit of that either. We're certainly not being supported. But I think if you increase fuel duty, and we've done a paper with Fair Fuel that demonstrates that when you increase duty, it puts less money back into people's pockets, and it has a detrimental effect on the overall economy. So you need to make sure you keep that balance pretty well focused.
Dominic.
Well, I think reform of fuel duty is going to have to come, as Martin mentioned, as we transition to alternative fuels and electric vehicles. It's going to be a massive chunk taken out of that 27 billion, and the Treasury's going to notice that chunk coming out of that 27 billion. So where does it come from? And road user charging, I know that's quite an unpopular idea. So we see surveys from the RAC, I think last year, showing that there's a bit of change in opinion around that. Maybe it's time to open that discussion again. It's not something we're kind of focusing on, to be honest. But, I mean, it's closing this gap, as you mentioned, Graham. If you're going to go for a zero-emission or low-emission vehicle, it's about price. You need some help closing the gap. It's too big at the moment. It just doesn't make you can't make the case for it. And this idea of a bonus-malus system where the increase in taxation on polluting vehicles goes directly towards helping people purchase cleaner vehicles. So I think it makes quite a lot of sense. I think that's what they're doing in France, not around the fuel duty, but I think using other kind of forms of taxation to create a bonus-malus kind of a system. We do have it here with VED, I suppose, but it's minimal. I mean, the changes to vehicle excise duty, it's more tokenism. It's not really making a massive difference. It's not going to influence the decision-making process. But I think taxation is a really key way to kind of close that gap, really.
A good point you make, actually, Dominic, about the incentives. The plugged-in van grant is £8,000 or 20 up to £8,000, maximum of 20%. If it's above 3.5 tonnes, it can be up to 20,000 for the first 200 vehicles. And 20,000 for a vehicle that's maybe a sort of 6-7 tonne vehicle is probably a reasonable level of incentive towards buying that vehicle. When you go up to an 18 or 26 tonne electric vehicle, where I would expect the cost of that vehicle to be in the region of maybe £300,000, £20,000 frankly isn't going to make any difference to a purchase decision. So you need to have a sliding scale mechanism which isn't based on a passenger car incentive which has been just sort of copy pasted onto commercial vehicles. You've got to have something which reflects the actual cost of that vehicle and is an incentive. If it's a 20% incentive, that's an incentive. If you get down to the incentive is sort of 7-8%, nobody's going to buy with that.
I was laughing earlier because I had this very heated debate with my 12-year-old daughter that's a bit of an eco-warrior, but I think reflects a lot of the mentality that is at that younger level, a lot of naivety in there. And her view was just put duties up and make all the fossil fuels far more expensive. My personal view, controversial as it might be, there is a time for that, and there is a time for that when there is a viable commercial alternative. Not at the times when there isn't, because all it does is just put everybody's cost of living up and puts pressure on everybody right the way through.
But I'll maybe phrase this question a little bit different. If then the government took the approach of, I will put the same level of fuel duty on your 34 gas-powered trucks as applies to the rest of your fleet, would you be making a different purchasing decision as a result of that?
Comes down to how the commercials work out.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, that's what it's about.
Because as the industry progresses, and it's made a huge amount of progress in terms of alternative drivetrains and that kind of thing, that is only growing exponentially, the government take from that will get smaller and smaller and smaller. So in some ways, taxation on those vehicles will change. And will that have a negative impact on adoption of alternative fuels?
Well, I think there's only so many ways that you can balance the books, isn't there? You know, and whether it comes back to that or whether it comes back to road user charging, you know, which is definitely the hobby horse that government are kind of charging at the moment. So I think the reality is what they want to do is that they want to make sure they haven't got a big hole, you know, in the coffers, you know, of the Treasury. So whatever changes, you know, within the market, you know, whatever rolls out, they are going to need to rebalance that, you know, whatever that looks like. But I guess at this stage, it's pretty uncertain, isn't it? Because I don't think we have any certainty over the speed of technology. We've got lots of, you know, decisions to drive cleaner air quicker, but we haven't got the solutions to do that, and we haven't got the commercials to balance it off. So I think, you know, as an industry, we're facing a lot of uncertainty around that. And whether or not, as we see this roll out, whether or not we get to the stage where we can actually push back and recharge that back, which means costs go up, I guess will remain to be seen.
Just curiously, in the last budget, the government froze the differential between natural gas and diesel for fuel duty up to 2032, which was very welcome. And that came following some lobbying which I and a whole group of other people were involved with. And that gives a certain degree of stability. So if diesel duty goes up, the gas will go up at the same amount. So it takes away a little risk for the operator. But we still haven't yet got anybody in government to do anything about excise duty, vehicle excise duty. So every time when I was working for Iveco that I put a gas vehicle on the road, registered it and had to pay for the road tax, the fact that it cost me the same price as a diesel vehicle always annoyed me. And it's not that the difference in the VED is going to be the difference between buying the vehicle or not buying the vehicle, but it's just a sign that can be given that relatively doesn't cost an awful lot of money.
I'd like to ask a bit more of a general question as we kind of approach the end of our time, in that do you feel that the road transport industry is doing enough in the face of the very clear environmental challenges that the country and the world, for that matter, clearly face at the moment? and you're all coming from very different viewpoints. So I'd kind of like to get your answer from that viewpoint. Dominic, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to many businesses in road transport, and I think there's huge willingness there, like from small business up to big businesses. And it's obviously smaller companies have got less margin to absorb these costs that are going to be hit hardest. And there's a willingness there, but it comes down to the realities of it. And we're, making a business case, we can make a bit of a stretch, especially when you see the way the, increasing regulations are going, which will happen. Restrictions will increase. So I think there's a willingness there, but it comes down to this lack of regulatory certainty. So you know which direction technology is going in, and support to close that gap so you can actually make a business case in the short term until that technology comes to scale and cost parity is kind of achieved. And I think, that's so I think there's a lot of progressive businesses in the sector who wanted to make the change. And as I said earlier, what we really have a gripe with is the auto sector, who's actually got a lot, created this issue actually, largely, and doesn't seem like there's much accountability there. So we'll be answering differently if I was on a platform there.
Graham?
Yeah, as an SME, obviously there's a limitation in what we can do individually. I think, yes, you could level criticism at the OEMs, and I think there is some accountability that needs to be there. But the sums of money involved in developing some of this technology is completely eye-watering. And I'd make the same statement. There isn't a charitable transport company in the room. There's not a charitable OEM across Europe. And you've got to remember, most of them are operating on certainly a European, most of them on a global stage. So what we're doing in the UK and within individual UK cities, to be honest, is just peripheral noise to what they're looking at on a bigger scale. Yeah. So again, we're not joining it up in the UK. Is it joining up internationally?
Absolutely.
Because otherwise you're never going to put pressure on the OEMs to get there, but at the same time, they have a business to run.
I think the industry is doing everything it possibly can under the commercial constraints that it's operating. And I think that if you look at the market, over the years, we have been screwed down more and more by manufacturers and retailers in terms of running more efficiently, taking fully costed loads out and round trips out where you are driving marginal costing and you are needing to network that vehicle, fully loaded each way. So there's not a lot left. And we've also got some very large 3PLs that also, I guess, subcontract an enormous amount of work out to the broader market that cream off the top. And for those regional hauliers that are doing a lot of the work for the big players, then they're having to work with even more constrained rates. So there's a fundamental, I guess, step change at the top of this, which is, what's the true cost of distribution? And retailers and manufacturers are going to have to kind of see, not just with this, but with the driver shortage as well, the cost of a driver's wages. I know there was some debate this morning to say that it's not the big issue, but it's one issue. But when you're competing against the market where you've got a train driver that works 32 hours and gets £52,000, we're competing against that. And therefore, why would you become a driver? But then if we've got to increase rates in order to attract drivers as well to pay the going rate, there are levels of increased cost here that need to be accepted and absorbed more fundamentally in order to kind of cover the elements that we're talking about. We're working within the commercial constraints of the market at the moment, and that's part of the challenge.
Martin?
I think one of the things which has been quite nice having retired is that I can look at things from a slightly different perspective. And one of the things I've been seeing when I look around at who's doing what on alternative fuels is that, yes, some of the big people in the market who you would expect to be working on alternatives are there. Some are doing some really good work. Others are playing a bit of lip service, quite frankly. But what's quite impressive is that there are actually some small companies who are finding that they can get alternative fuels to work in their operations. And particularly when you start looking at gas vehicles, the issue there is all about the infrastructure. And if you're fortunate enough to be running in an operation where infrastructure is present, you can make it work, even a small vehicle. One of the fleets that I've been talking to is running something, a total fleet of around about a dozen vehicles, and they're running about 4 or 5 gas vehicles, and they're getting it to work. They do very high mileage, and that helps. That's part of the trick. But the fact they're willing to try it is really quite laudable. You don't have to be the DHLs, the big companies to be able to do something.
And then just one final question, maybe a very short answer from all of you, if you don't mind. What could be the one quick fix that we're all missing out on in terms of the road transport industry's effects on the environment, in a nutshell?
Zero emission capability.
Richard?
Commercial financial support.
Bigger, longer trucks.
And Dominic?
So regulatory certainty to help the industry know where things are going, where the direction of travel is.
So we'll just fix all 4 of those in the next few years and then we'll all be fine. Brilliant. Okay, I think that's pretty much come to the end of our time. I'm sure someone's going to nod and wave at me at some point on that. So I'd like to thank Microlise for the opportunity for having this debate. Thank you very much. And also a big thank you to all of our panellists. You've been great. I really appreciate your contributions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.